Hello and welcome to a very special episode 10, season 4, which also happens to be episode 100 of Future of XYZ. And we are going to be speaking today about a very, very, very big future of topic, the future of the internet. David Kirkpatrick, thank you for being our guest on this episode.
Well, thank you for having me, Lisa. It's fun to be here. It is a big topic.
It's a very big topic, and as we always have, not a huge amount of time, but your expertise is so distinguished in this field. I'm really happy to have you on. Not only are you the founder of Techonomy, which obviously is a conference and digital media company at the intersection of the internet, technology, business, and social progress, which I, of course, appreciate. You served as editor-in-chief there for 12 years. Before that, you were 25 years at Forbes, where you founded and hosted their Brainstorm series. At Fortune, sorry, I said Forbes. Fortune.
I have written for Forbes, but I was at Fortune all that time.
Very, very different magazines, but thank you for correcting me. You've written a number of books. You're writing a new book right now focused on climate tech. You've written a lot about Mark Zuckerberg, which you and I share an opinion about, and how we originally connected. But, you know, I think besides being a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and doing all sorts of other stuff, your passion and expertise in the space that is the internet is why we're going to be talking about the future of the internet. I want to just start, as I always do, with the very foundational question of, like, what is the internet? Like, in 2023, how do we define it?
Wow, that's a tough one at the moment. The internet is obviously an interconnected set of nodes, digital nodes that it spans literally the entire planet and even outer space. It's a system that was initially invented by the military for nuclear war protection, survivability, but it has become, I would say, in common parlance, the platform of global communication. It is the interstitial tissue that unites humanity.
Which is a crazy kind of broad definition, but I appreciate it. And I want to talk about how that interconnection works, because we obviously during COVID really saw how global and globally dependent we are, and how shared the experience on this tiny little planet is, and the internet as a role. I think what's fascinating to me about the way that the internet has progressed. I mean, in 1981, the first personal computer was introduced. That's only 42 years ago, you know? That's like after I mean, I'm older than a personal computer, you know, and yet in our little pockets today with our little phones, you know, we carry more processing power than what NASA had to send the various Apollo missions to the moon. I mean, the internet seems like, frankly, it's kind of akin to fire or the printing press or airplanes. Like, I mean, is this one of the greatest inventions or innovations of man?
Oh, absolutely. The internet is one of the greatest inventions of all time, and one of the most transformative technology phenomena of not only our lifetime, but of really the history of humanity. However, I just want to make one thing clear. When you say we, you've got to always remember, and this is the key fact that Americans are very bad at remembering, that over 2.5 billion people are still unconnected from the internet. That is hard to conceive given the degree to which we live on this medium, but it is not all of humanity, and that is a global crisis. It's just worth mentioning.
Well, and I think you're exactly correct. At the beginning of this year, it's 5.16 billion people are actually connected to the internet, which actually only amounts to like 2/3 of the world's population. I mean, that's, and in America, in rural America, where you don't have broadband, or it's certainly not 5G, it becomes a crisis, right? In many places of access, of equity, of opportunity.
Yeah, I think the U.S. is doing better slowly, and there's a lot of movement right now to extend connectivity to more broadly to the rural areas, et cetera. But it's really those 2.5 billion people that I worry about, because they are not part of the global economy, and they know it. So that's an issue. But I know that's not our main topic here. But it is as superbly important, life altering for all of us. It's so all encompassing in its impact on our lives that it is very difficult sometimes to even assess it, because it is like the air we breathe, as I think you said. So, but it isn't, of course. It's actually a human made and managed system that has flaws and poses risks of dysfunction and failure that we cannot disregard.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And it leads really nicely because on the one hand, there's this positive effect, especially for the 66% of the world who's connected in terms of education, access, research, all these things, efficiency, frankly, since that's what we always think about in capitalistic terms, But there are also real threats and in growing ones in terms of privacy and security risks. Obviously, the mental health component, especially for kids, of over screen time, of social media. What are some of the biggest kind of, let's call them, risks and challenges and opportunities that the internet poses for our immediate future, in your expert opinion?
You're very good at asking big questions. A lot of the risks are not unconnected to what we were discussing before about those who are disconnected, because even those who are connected, many of them are relatively new users of a medium that they don't really understand. And that's not true only in the developing world. It's also true in the developed world. It also, you'd even include young people who come on, they think they know the sea they swim in, but in reality, they have no sense of the power of the medium that they participate in once they join TikTok or Instagram or WhatsApp or whatever. So the risks, to even just to list them could be a long list. Disinformation certainly comes to mind very quickly. And, I wrote a book about Facebook, as you mentioned, and, I do see Facebook as having been very culpable in changing the information landscape to legitimize a kind of irrational opinionizing that is now more or less universal. So everybody thinks they're an expert and they don't really recognize or respect authority and the sources of information that are validated and checked. And so we have a rampant spread of fake news is just the sort of symptom, but the disease is failure to understand the world, failure to understand democracy and the systems that do determine the actual physical functioning of society. And I think the internet, while it also radically, vastly improves the functioning of many of those systems, a gigantic risk that has emerged is that it undermines people's effective participation in governance, whether it's democracy or any other form of governance, really. Ironically, I know we're not going to talk very much about China, but one of the things about China that's always impressed me was that until recently, all of its leaders have been PhD engineers who actually understood how technology and the internet work better than leaders of other governments, which is one reason they knew they had to build a great firewall and they had to control the four sources of information if they were going to retain their disproportionate power of the minority that the Communist Party represents. And I sort of respect that in a way. But our government, most governments don't understand. That's another big risk, is that the nature of the technology's evolution and its speed, which is probably the single biggest thing happening right now, is just the speed of change driven by technology platform change.
Yes.
Governments simply cannot keep up. And that worries me. That is one of the biggest things that's happening now, is this disequilibrium between the pace of change and government's ability to understand.
Completely. I so badly want to dive into this rabbit hole with you. I will just say that a few years ago when Sheryl Sandberg, who's no longer at Meta, it was still called Facebook at the time, and Mark Zuckerberg showed up in front of Congress, was to me one of the most shocking and embarrassing moments in our kind of modern history of our government not understanding the basic workings of the world's largest media technology company. And I think you're correct that this is a huge risk of the disequilibrium. And the internet has brought about kind of the rise of these super corporations, as well as these megalomaniacs like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, who control major access, to the world's information, as you said, as well as the humans' connectivity. So I think that there is, I don't know if that's inevitable with this disequilibrium, if you will, or how we manage kind of this outsized power and cult of personality, frankly.
Well, let's be clear. We don't know how to manage it. The people who run those companies don't really, in many cases, know how to manage it. Governments don't know how to oversee it. In a sense, we are being, the tail is wagging the dog, and our creation is manipulating us beyond our capacity to react. And obviously, artificial intelligence and generative AI is compounding that problem right now to a substantial degree.
Absolutely. I want to come back to the pace of change. I mean, I call it exponentialization. I mean, because the pace is reading. But I think back, in 1965, Gordon Moore, who was the founder of Intel, came up with this thing that came to be known as Moore's Law. And he suggested that microprocessing memory, or the number of transactions on any given microchip, would be doubling every 2 years, while the price of computers would be cut in half. So this kind of inverse relationship. You have Ray Kurzweil, I don't know how to say his last name, Kurzweil.
Yeah.
And he wrote this amazing book about the singularity, right? And he talks about the singularity is basically define Moore's Law, that we are going way past Moore's Law, and we actually don't know how to manage that. And I think his visual on it is so relevant, which is it's like climbing to the top of a mountain and being handed a jetpack when you get to the top and just going, straight vertical. And that exponentialization of change, since the Intel 404s, the first microprocessor was introduced in 1971, is in fact driving, as you said, the potential demise of democracy through misinformation, disinformation, connectivity, all these negative things, but also all the positive. So, I mean, are there other changes right now that you see happening in the space of the internet writ large that are really going to impact the future of, human brains, corporations, the world at large?
Well, I mean, one of the things about generative AI right now, which of course is the topic du jour, and rightly so, is that we don't even really understand how it works. So we've passed into a new phase of technology management and technology human impact, in that now our most powerful tools are to some extent beyond our comprehension, even though they haven't yet reached the point where they are smarter than us, which many AI researchers worry about very actively. But part of what it represents to me, and I just don't think we can underscore it enough, is the pace of change driven by technological connectivity is outpacing our ability to really adapt as humanity. And that is, again, compounded by the fact that there's 2.5 billion people being sort of dragged along, but without even seeing it and not even having the ability to make the same mistakes we're making. But you've got to recognize and underscore that this generative AI transformation and AI generally is a fundamental new phase of the internet's evolution, and one that we are only beginning to take stock of, which has spectacularly positive potentiality as well as very, very frightening possible downsides. I probably am a little more on the optimist side. Yeah, I'm like 55% optimistic about AI's long-term prognosis, but I too recognize tremendous risks. That people think AI could destroy humanity, literally, and not very far in the future if we don't get a grip on it, which we will not do. But that's scary.
That is very scary. I mean, there's so many threads here that I could pull out, David, but I'm always cognizant of time, and I like the 55% optimism. And one of the places you've invested that optimism, I think, is into this climate tech. One of the things that's always, not always, but since 10 years ago when I started learning about like data centers, these air conditioning, these huge energy sucks, and they place these, things up in, rural areas or not so rural areas. There's a whole thing about imminent domain type behavior of these tech companies. But generally, we're talking about what the processing power requires in terms of demands on our energy. And of course, until we transition to fully green energy, we are just sucking, we're hurting ourselves the more data we use. And I think, in 2010, Google's co-founder, Eric Schmidt, declared we were creating more data every 2 days than we had in the whole history of the human race up until that moment. And so I think what's amazing about that is that we are, and then that didn't account for AI, That doesn't account for blockchain and crypto. That doesn't account for VR, AR. That doesn't account for all of these newer technologies that are facilitated by the internet that are just sucking energy. And I don't know if we have any innovation in the horizon line that is going to help offset that. So in your mind's eye, where you're investing this, what are the actions that are needed to mitigate the climate effects of the internet, and how can we do better?
Well, I think we will do better, even though a huge amount of energy is being squandered and very poorly utilized in managing today's internet, particularly in the mining of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in specific. That's unconscionable to some degree. When I said 55% optimism, though, that was really about generative AI. And the macro level, I'm much more than 55% optimistic about the future of humanity, although one has to sort of leaven it with this AI risk. But I still am very optimistic that we can address our problems. And one reason I am optimistic, even specifically about our potential to act on the climate relatively rapidly enough, and there's plenty of caveats here, we're not going to talk about that, but is that technology is going to be a much more effective tool to address our problems than most people realize. Like, here's just an example, and this is where generative AI is such a yin and yang thing. I just saw today an article that was estimating that for most software programming tasks, generative AI will allow programmers to accomplish roughly 40% of the work without doing anything other than using AI. So that means, a 40% increase in the speed of programming for any problem. Many, many, many of our global climate problems and our national problems of all sorts, but especially in climate, will require software evolution and innovation, which now will happen faster. Moore's law, which you mentioned, is still happening in some sense, and that is going to be an incredible gift to humankind. And we cannot overlook that, which is easy to do. It doesn't mean that we just sit back and let it happen, obviously. It has to be harnessed willfully, and absolutely the United States and most developed countries, most countries everywhere still are not harnessing technology for climate action nearly as much as they need to. But I believe, especially if the will can be found, the technology will follow that really achieves many of mankind's goals. But that doesn't mean we'll stay below 1.5 degrees. It does mean that we will probably be able to continue inhabiting our planet. Whether the Gulf Stream stops or some horrible thing like that, we can't predict. But I am very optimistic about our adaptability if we can recognize the power of technology. And again, if governments and business can work together much more effectively than they have done up to now, because I see that as absolutely indispensable. And it is sort of one of our big challenges of the moment, is figuring out it with AI, with climate tech, et cetera. Government and business have to partner better. And just a final quick note on that, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States was a major step in that direction.
I totally agree. Let's talk really briefly, and then we're going to have to wrap, which is tragic, actually, as your expertise and passion for this subject is so apparent. But let's talk quickly about government oversight and regulation today and what's needed in the future. It's clear that we don't have time to wait for governments, not just the U.S. government, but any government other than China, and frankly, that's a whole different topic, to become informed enough for regulation, as you say, for the tail not to be wagging the dog. What is the role then of regulation and governmental oversight of the internet and all of its aspects as we look towards the future?
It's a very hard question. I mean, Europe has led the way in thinking through what is possible, and they continue to do so with some regulatory approaches that I generally applaud. I think they've had global influence in a good way for the most part. I do think we need to go to a new phase of government-tech interaction, which not enough people are really contemplating. Brad Smith, who is the president of Microsoft, is one who's talked about this very extensively, and I agree with them heartily. We need to have far more organized dialogue, colloquies at the highest level between government and business leaders and senior tech experts on how tech and government should collaborate, because it's really going to have to be collaboration. Government's not going to be able to come in and tamp things down at the pace that will be needed. And that might not be right anyway. And especially, you don't want to deter innovation, but you don't want to allow ineffective or dangerous innovation to run rampant. And this is really, really hard. Really, really hard. Europe has a huge directorate of tech experts that advise the European Commission, which we don't even have in the United States. Newt Gingrich eliminated the Congressional Technology Budget or Technology Office, whatever it was called. So, our government is to some extent, driving blind. Military tends to be where most of the expertise is in the intelligence
completely
area.
Blind.
But there are a lot of pockets developing in the Department of Energy and elsewhere that are very impressive. But this is an unresolved question that has to take the attention of leaders in both government and business much more than it has. That's all I can really say. It's a huge challenge.
Yep. I appreciate the honesty of that answer and couldn't agree more that partnership and getting informed. I mean, it's the first step towards anything, right? Getting educated, getting informed.
There's one thing I was hoping to say before. I wanted to say before we end. I wrote a piece for Techonomy in 2017 about Facebook, Google, and Amazon. And the headline was "Too big to tolerate, too big to stop." And that is still the situation we are in. And it's very scary. The power those companies have really is irrational from a societal standpoint, from a citizen's point of view. They should not have so much unchecked power. One person like Mark Zuckerberg should not have so much authority over human dialogue and news dissemination, etc. But we still haven't addressed that problem. But it's been that way for a long time. Like I said, I wrote that in 2017.
I appreciate that point. It's a very valid one. It talks to a lot of the pieces that we've tried to pull together in this conversation. So I guess as we end, David, with the future of the internet, I have to look ahead. The future of the internet. You've kind of alluded to some of this, but if you were to say, what is your greatest hope for the internet in, say, 20 years' time? What is your greatest hope?
Wow. Well, first of all, that all humans would be on it, whatever it is. That's first. That would be critical. We haven't even talked about mobile. That's obviously a massive influential factor in all of this and a critical piece of the ecosystem. I do believe we are moving toward a sort of augmented reality world where everything in the world will be essentially annotated, and we will see through some kind of glasses or other tools that will allow us to interact much more intelligently with the natural world. I would hope that we have sophisticatedly applied AI to manage human systems to eliminate our carbon and methane generation so that we can continue to inhabit the planet, and that the internet would have been useful for that. I hope that it would have become a more effective global medium for education. Forget about entertainment. That's going to be a given. But I think all these things are possible. But 20 years is so long in technology terms that honestly, it's very, very perilous to even try to hypothesize what might be happening by then. I'd like to say by finishing in a sense that I remain optimistic that if governments and business and public citizens, civil society can collaborate more effectively, which I don't necessarily assume is possible, but I hope it's possible. I think it's conceivable. We can make this continued acceleration of the pace of living driven by technology more than tolerable. Let's just put it that way. I do believe that.
More than tolerable. That is David Kirkpatrick, expert in everything internet and technologies. Greatest hope. I appreciate, David, so much you joining us on this special 100th anniversary episode of Future of XYZ.
Thank you, Lisa.
For everyone watching, you should know that you can also listen anywhere you get your podcast. Just search for Future of XYZ and leave us a 5-star review so that everyone else can find us. If you are listening, you can also watch this podcast at ripbs.org/XYZ. Make sure you follow us at Future of XYZ on Instagram, and you can visit us and nominate guests or yourself at future-of.xyz. We are so thrilled you listen. Thank you for participating. And David Kirkpatrick, thank you for this conversation on the future of the internet.
Thank you again. It was really a good conversation.